for your comments. And just letting a few more people in, waiting for the recording to start. It has not started yet. I'm going to share this. It's not going to be that easy to see. All right, welcome to American Literature, Topics in American Literature at Tennessee Tech University with Mr. Smith. Our guest today is a PhD candidate in literature and a renowned poet and singer from Memphis, Tennessee, alumnus of Tennessee Tech University, Justin Williams. Justin, why don't you wave to everybody here and say hello? And you're gonna get the floor here in a minute to take over, but we're gonna start with Bob Kaufman, and this is his collected works that I recently purchased, and a collected works of the great Amiri Baraka. Now, if you recall, on Monday, when Amiri Baraka was better known as Leroy Jones, he co-edited The Floating Bear with Diane DePrima, and he is a baby daddy of one of Diane DePrima's many children. They're both passed on now, but Dominique DePrima is an activist and DJ out on the West Coast, and one of Amiri Baraka's sons is, I think, the mayor of a town in New Jersey, and he's a performance poet as well. So their lineage goes on. They're very much part of my lineage, but this is a difficult day for me insofar as I've not devoted the kind of studies I have to Anne Waldman, Diane DePrima, Allen Ginsberg, and Kerouac to these people. But maybe in a future iteration of this course, there will be a more thorough introduction to these folks. One thing to notice about Bob Kaufman, though, is the idea that he actually was a beatnik. We've distinguished the beat generation from the beatniks, the beat being the movement and the beatniks being the cultural phenomenon, and sometimes the cultural phenomenon that is somewhat derivative and pejorative. But Kaufman is credited by some for having coined the term beatnik and for being a beatnik. And he was a bit of an outlaw. He spent time in jail. And as a poet, as my primary vocation, you can't shut me up. I write poetry because I must, but Bob Kaufman took a multi-year vow of silence in protest of the Vietnam War. And so for a poet to take a vow of silence is an enormous gesture. So he's known for founding the journal Beatitude with Allen Ginsberg. Born in New Orleans in 1925, his lineage alone speaks wonders. To him, a German Jewish father and a Black Catholic mother. He spent a brief time in the Merchant Marine, studied at the New School in New York, moved to San Francisco, and became affiliated with the Beat movement, including Greg Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Allen Ginsberg. He was a jazz-inspired street poet who adhered to an oral tradition, proclaiming his poetry in coffeehouses and on the streets. If you look in the text, there's on page 327, there's a wonderful brief biography of him. And the influence of jazz shows up in his poetry on pages 328 and 329, such as the poem Round About Midnight, jazz radio on a midnight kick, round about midnight, sitting on the bed with a jazz type chick, round about midnight, piano laughter in my ears, round about midnight, stirring laughter, drowning tears, round about midnight, soft blue voices, muted grins, excited voices, father's sins, round about midnight. Come on, baby, take off your clothes, round about midnight. And the poem On is a chant poem. We've been studying chant poems, Justin, and I've encouraged them. They have a creative assignment to write a chant poem themselves. But the use of a format where each line mirrors the next line is really evident in the chant poem On, which is on the top of page 329. On yardbird corners of embryonic hopes drowned in a heroin tear. On yardbird corners of Parker flights to sound-filled pockets in space. On neuro corners of stripped brains and desperate electrosurgeons. On alcohol corners of pointless discussions and historical hangovers. On television corners of literary cornflakes and Rockwell's impotent America. On university corners of tailored intellect and Greek letter openers. On military corners of megaton deaths and universal anesthesia. on religious corners of theological limericks, and on radio corners of century-long records and static events, on advertising corners of filter-tipped ice cream and instant instants, on teenage corners of comic book seduction and corrupted guitars, on political corners of wanted candidates and ritual lies, on motion picture corners of Lassie and other symbols, on intellectual corners of conversational therapy and analyzed fear, on newspaper corners of sexy headlines and scholarly comics, on love-divided corners of die now, paid later mortuaries, on philosophical corners of semantic desperados and idea mongers, on middle-class corners of private school puberty and anatomical revolts, on ultra-real corners of love, on abandoned roller coasters, on lonely poet corners of low-lying leaves and moist prophet eyes. I challenge the class, if somebody wants to write an on poem, just take the format, steal the basic format. Maybe you could say, pick another word besides corners to repeat throughout the line and write an exact mimicry of this poem. We've talked a lot about imitation, Justin, and how important it is. I want to introduce one other thing about Kaufman, and then I'm going to tip to our guest and give Justin the floor. And I knew Justin because we were part of the poetry scene. We actually had a poetry scene at Tech when Justin was here, and we met at the open mics at First and Cedar down there on Cedar Street, near where 37 Cedar is. There used to be a open mic venue, and then of course at the Backdoor Playhouse, where we still have open mics to this day. But two things that Kaufman was involved in that are very beat that I haven't talked enough about yet. One was broadsides. As opposed to a book, a broadside was a single sheet that would be distributed because it was less expensive. And this broadside was actually published by City Lights. City Lights, of course, being the bookstore and publisher in San Francisco that published Howl, that went on trial for Howl, as we studied last week. And then, of course, also where the poet Ferlinghetti, who we've also looked at, was the kind of patron of the movement in the Bay Area, in the North Beach neighborhood. It's San Francisco is a big place. You got to even know which neighborhood we're talking about. North Beach is a very special neighborhood. But they published a broadside of Kaufman's for 35 cents. And the genre was the manifesto, and he made up a word, abominist. And some people think it was based on his name, but some people think it was a mashup of the phrase A-bomb, referring to the atomic bomb, and the word communist, or any really ist. It could be fascist or anarchist or socialist or surrealist, because all of these ists, all these isms and ists were swirling around in the beat times. Now, of course, isms are problematic. I have a friend who likes to say all isms are wasms. So there you go. But I'm going to read you just a couple of lines of the Abominist Manifesto out of his collected works, Bob Kaufman. And remember his lineage. He's mixed race. He's mixed religious lineage. So he's a mixtape. He's a walking mixtape. We're also studying mixtapes in this class, Justin. And their final is that they get to make their own mixtape. Abomunists join nothing but their hands or legs or other same. Abomunists spit anti-poetry for poetic reasons and frank. Abomunists do not look at pictures painted by presidents and unemployed prime ministers. In times of national peril, abomunists, as reality Americans, stand ready to drink themselves to death for their country. Abomunists do not feel pain, no matter how much it hurts. Abomunists do not use the word square except when talking to squares. Abomunists read newspapers only to ascertain their abominability. I can't even say the word abominability. One of the things that we talked about when we were talking about Ginsberg was this idea of nonsense or gibberish or made up words. The Beats were famous for this. Abomunists never carry more than $50 in debts. Abomunists believe that the solution to problems of religious bigotry is to have a Catholic candidate for president and a Protestant candidate for pope. Well, we got one of those. We got one of those twice. We got one of those, but we never had a Protestant pope, not yet. Abomunists do not write for money. They write for the money itself. Abomunists believe only that when they dream, after it comes true. Abomunist children must be raised abominably. Abominist poets, confident that the new literary form, footprintism, has freed the artist of outmoded restrictions such as the ability to read and write or the desire to communicate, must be prepared to read their work at dental colleges, embalming schools, homes for unwed mothers, homes for wed mothers, insane asylums, sane asylums, USO canteens, kindergartens, and county jails. Abominists never compromise their rejectionary philosophy. Abominists reject everything except snowman. And it goes on for several pages, the whole abominist thing. It's all made up. It's all wordplay. It's all playful. It is all in the realm of what's called the absurd, which is adjacent to surrealism and Dada, two great 20th century movements. And I would just say, Google them. Because we've been adjacent to, I can't spell surrealism either, Justin, but we've been adjacent to surrealism and Dada for the whole class. We have not taken a deep dive into them primarily being originally European movements in poetics and art. So I'm just gonna, that is a whirlwind speed dating introduction to the great Bob Kaufman, but we're going to go ahead and tip to Justin because he's giving of his time. I'm not paying him, and he's got a PhD dissertation to write and many songwriting showcases to attend in Memphis. So from the west side of our beautiful pancake-shaped state of Tennessee, Tennessee Tech alumnus coming home for the hour to talk to us about Amiri Baraka. And please, Justin, give us your backstory with Baraka before you dive into his work so we can learn a little bit about your dissertation and the fantastic work that you're doing over there in Memphis, Tennessee. So welcome to the call, Justin Williams.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This is so fun to talk about Baraka. As Andy was mentioning, I went to Tech. I graduated in 2012. I did literature there. You mentioned First and Cedar earlier. Brings back so many memories. And was part of the poetry scene and did some spoken word stuff there and still doing music and things like that here. So I'm doing my PhD in literary cultural studies at the U of M now. And I specialize in African American poetry here. I didn't have a lot of introduction to the material that I'm studying now and writing my dissertation about beforehand, but actually when I came to Memphis, my first semester, I took a class on Amiri Baraka because my professor is a scholar of Amiri Baraka, and I had no idea. I didn't know anything about him other than the Wikipedia article that I'd read beforehand. And what really made me fall in love with Baraka was this book, Blues People, where he does this. It's one of his early works that he's writing, I think in the early 60s, where he does this whole kind of history of the blues, and he kind of begins with like spirituals in the 19th century, but it's also like a kind of social history. And I've always been a big fan of blues and jazz. So I'm like, oh, you mean I can do literature and I can talk about music at the same time? This is awesome. And so a lot of my dissertation kind of looks at the history of higher education alongside African-American poets. African-American literature is not really taught in American universities until the 1970s. And that's largely because you have student protest and things like that. As Black students start going to predominantly white universities, they start kind of putting pressure on universities to change the curriculum, which there's a big history of student protest at American universities, but not many of them are demanding changes to the curriculum. So that's a very sort of unusual kind of part of the history of American universities. you can it's a very interesting subject matter. It's called the Third World Liberation Strike. That kind of starts at I think San Francisco State College as one of the first ones, but then it kind of swells, and there are copies of the same protest, and by the end of the 1960s, something like 700 American universities have adopted Black studies programs and or Chicano studies or Native American studies. And that's kind of a very tucked away, not studied part of like that spins out of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, maybe more closely. So Baraka is a very complicated individual. Like, as I said, I spent an entire semester on him, and he was a very prolific writer. He kind of starts writing in the late 50s, early 60s, and he's writing all the way until like, I think he died in 2016, I want to say, but he's still publishing, like, a year before his death. And he's a poet, he's a novelist, he writes plays, he's writing essays. He's also just very, very involved in like activist things. And sort of maybe just a quick background of his kind of the beat era. Baraka is born into a middle-class family in New Jersey, and he ends up going to Howard University. At the time, Toni Morrison was a professor at Howard, and he takes classes from this poet, Sterling Brown. And he's not a very good student. He ends up dropping out and joining the Air Force, which he calls in his autobiography the error farce. But he ends up working in the library when he's in the Air Force, and just uses this time to like listen to lots of jazz records and read books. And so he's reading like a lot of the modernists, like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot and folks like that. And I believe he is kicked out of the Air Force now, I want to say, and he ends up going to New York City, moving to kind of the Greenwich Village area and joining up with a lot of the beats. And in this period, he's kind of very much like involved in the scene. He's Leroy Jones. If you ever read kind of the beat stuff and they refer to Leroy, they are almost certainly referring to Baraka. And then Baraka, he kind of goes through, his life becomes a story of like multiple conflicting conversions, where in his autobiography, he talks about once Malcolm X dies in, I believe that's 64, he has a sort of complete change where he decides to embrace radical Black politics, and he leaves sort of his cohort of beats, moves to Harlem, and joins the Black Power movement in different capacities. But he's really known for starting and being the architect of something called the Black Arts Movement. And the Black Arts Movement is kind of mainly based in Harlem. That's like one of the main ones, but you get satellites of this movement all over the country, mostly in like urban centers. And the Black Arts Movement, actually, let's see, hang on, let me get my notes here. The Black Arts Movement styles itself as the sister movement of the Black Power movement. And so in the same sense that the Black Power movement is kind of advocating for kind of social policy changes. And I mean, we know that maybe you know the pictures of the very militant looking men with like berets and burnishing weapons and things like that. But the Black Power movement's also doing like free breakfast programs in their neighborhoods, where this is like kind of a precursor to free lunch programs in schools. They like kind of did community outreach. They also did sickle cell testing before that was really even a thing. And the Black Arts movement were kind of trying to do the cultural, like poetry theater counterpart of that movement, where they're writing. They are not interested in an art for art's sake. This is a very important kind of point, like that they're not just trying to write beautiful things that, this is lovely to read. Baraka is not a poet that you take to the beach to read. He's a very uncomfortable kind of experience at a lot of, because he's not interested in your feelings at all. He's like trying to make political statements, and so he's interested in like overt, shocking, incendiary kind of statements, and that's something that he carries on for his entire life. He changes, like, in a lot of ways, like his politics change. Like obviously has the name change to becomes Amiri Baraka. At another point, he's Imamu Baraka. And so when we talk about Baraka, we kind of have to say, like, which Baraka are we talking about? Because the Baraka of the 60s looks very different than the Baraka of the 90s. So like, can't understate how much of a break that he had from the beat movement. Like, he's very much like, he writes a poem that I'm not sharing today, but if you're curious, called Black Dada, where it's literally, he's imagining this kind of monster figure eating his white friends. So very, very interesting poem, to say the least. But he becomes really well known after he writes this play called Dutchman in the 60s. He gets an Obie Award for this play, and that one is very commonly anthologized, very short play that that's fantastic to read. And there's also a free video of it online. Anyway, what else? So just a funny story. Again, like I said, he's a very incendiary kind of poet, definitely not a comfortable kind of experience all the time. But he becomes the poet laureate of New Jersey in the early 2000s. And when the governor approaches him about appointing him to this position, he basically says, yeah, you're going to regret appointing me to this position. and the governor appoints him anyway. And he ends up writing right after he gets commissioned to write a poem about 9/11. And he writes this poem called Somebody Blew Up America. And reads it to something like, a huge crowd of people. And they are so upset that he writes this poem, which is, again, not a very friendly poem, that they can't fire him from the poet laureate because it's a contracted 2-year thing. So they pass legislation where they completely abolish the position entirely. So there's no poet laureate in New Jersey now. But I mean, even there's a wonderful essay called A Post-Racial Anthology that he wrote in 2014, where he's still it's a review of a book of poetry that is just very critical of this particular anthology. And he's just still swinging late in life. But I've got a few poems that I thought I'd share, and we can kind of talk about it a little bit. I picked one. The first one is kind of from his beat era. I don't know if it's in your book or not, but
I don't think any of the poems that we picked are. So just go ahead and read them to us. But I've got my my SOS book here, and I might type a couple lines in the chat, but you don't have to worry about that. So
okay, I've got a link to the first one, and I'll
fantastic.
just post it in the
Even
chat.
better.
So if you want to follow along,
even better.
Yeah. So this is preface to a 20-volume suicide note. This is the title poem of his collection by the same name, which if you just like think about the title for a second, if you have a 20-volume suicide note, that's kind of like, it's sort of a gallows humor. You're not like planning on going out anytime soon. And yeah, we'll just read through it. For Kelly Jones, born 16 May 1959. Lately, I've become accustomed to the way the ground opens up and envelops me each time I go out to walk the dog, or the broad edge silly music the wind makes when I run for a bus. Things have come to that. And now each night I count the stars, and each night I get the same number. And when they will not come to be counted, I count the holes they leave. Nobody sings anymore. And then last night, I tiptoed up to my daughter's room and heard her talking to someone. And when I opened the door, there was no one there, only she on her knees, peeking into her own clasped hands. This one, this is a poem that I think really kind of shows a lot of things about like early Baraka. Like he's definitely like a very like well-versed like poet, and this is like a pretty straightforward poem, but has a lot of like, still has like a kind of edgy experimentalness that would characterize Baraka's poetry throughout his life. Like the idea of the 20-volume suicide note, like that he's, and that it's also a preface. So this is a character of like, you kind of have this existential longing, like he has this moment as a father where he hears his daughter talking to someone. There's this moment of fear, and then it turns out that she's at her bed praying. But then you have this this line at the end, like talking to someone, and when I opened the door, there was no one there. And then he doesn't say she was praying, he says she was peeking into her own clasped hands. And so there's a kind of like emptiness of that this narrator kind of notices in the piece. Let's see, and if you'll have any questions or comments, feel free to drop it in the chat. And so, yeah, this is not necessarily like a typical poem, but this is just a very, very anthologized, and it's passed around a lot. And so this is kind of when he's still in the Beat Generation. And then after he sort of leaves and has this like after Malcolm X dies and he kind of starts the Black Arts movement, we get his sort of like this big shifts in the kind of tonality of his poems, where it's a much more activist oriented kind of poetry. It's about getting Black people involved in the movement. And so it's very targeted in that regard. The title poem of the book of collected poems, SOS, is probably one of his most famous. It's very short, just SOS, calling Black people, calling all Black people, man, woman, child, wherever you are, calling you, urgent, come in, Black people, come in, wherever you are, urgent, calling you, calling all Black people, come in, Black people, come on in. So very, very short poem. Um, and you get this, again, like the kind of experimentation with, there's, if you can think of like a radio, I always think of a radio announcer when I hear that poem, because there are an SOS call that Baraka is playing with this kind of, he grew up listening to radio, and he references a lot of radio programs and his poems that he grew up with. And so the kind of call to kind of join in these like kind of political movements. It's definitely a chant, and he's very interested in the kind of musicality of that. But then there's an urgency to this message that like now is the moment to join in this movement and this political time. But then there's also like sorry, I'm gonna pull it up again. But the last line, calling all Black people, come in, Black people, come on in. I think is something that really lands, where there's a sort of urgency, but there's also a warmth, that like an invitation to kind of to join, like almost like churchy in a sense. Yes, definitely an invocation. So this is kind of coming up like after he's had this like first conversion. And I've got one more. This is from Baraka in the 90s. It's from a collection I think I have with me. Don't I? Yeah. And that they're like Baraka draws from like this like preacher tradition, even as he's kind of like really harshly criticizing the Black middle class for kind of accusing the bourgeoisie of trying to fit in and get along without like actually trying to change and make society better. And so Baraka is just kind of consumes everything. Like he's not just interested in literature, he's interested in music, he's interested in culture, and he uses all of this as his palette to kind of compose his poems, and also infuse them with these kind of like weird kind of images and radical politics and things like that. So this book, Wise, 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 I'm just going to read the first poem from that. And this is a book that he describes as like a long poem, even though it's like broken up into several poems. And it sort of attempts to tell the history of the African American experience. And it's called The Griot's Song, subtitled. And so you get I don't know if you saw this, but the title of the book is actually this, Wise, Wise, Wise. So Baraka does a lot of wordplay like this, like where he's using homophones and in this kind of way, and playing on these different kind of wise as in wisdom, or questioning like the world and how things came to be, and kind of looking for answers. And so there's a kind of like thirst that Baraka has throughout his life of just like understanding like how American history plays into these different aspects of the Black experience. So this is Wise One. And he's got a note on the side of it that says, nobody knows the trouble I seen. And so like he intended to perform all these poems in the context of with having a band or music played behind it. He actually performed with a group called Blue Arc for something like the last 20 or 30 years of his life. And there's a couple of like MP3s or videos of him playing with Blue Arc, and they are fantastic. Like they're just like a kind of a jazz quartet sort of situation where he's doing the poems over that. So this would be a poem that would have like Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, like kind of playing in the background. There's a video of it on a YouTube video of it on online. Yes, absolutely. And like Jane Cortez, like another fantastic one that does that. Okay, wise one. If you ever find yourself somewhere lost and surrounded by, did I drop off there?
You're fine. I can still hear you.
Okay, cool.
Class,
cool.
Are you still hearing our guest?
I am.
Okay, good. Yeah. All right. Yeah, you're still good. All right. Back to it, Justin.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Wise one. If you ever find yourself somewhere lost and surrounded by enemies who won't let you speak in your own language, who destroy your statues and instruments, who ban your boom ba then you are in trouble, deep trouble. They ban your boom ba boom. You in deep trouble. Probably take you several hundred years to get out. So I think of this poem as kind of like a warning, like that kind of introduces this book of poems where you have the speaker who gives us a situation. If you ever find yourself somewhere lost and surrounded by enemies, and so it's definitely like thinking about the slave trade in being brought over from another country and landing in America, and the kind of situation of slavery. If you ever find yourself in this situation, you're in deep trouble. Then the kind of like characteristic, like there's a lot of percussive sounds in that, this boom ba boom, and then it's got a bit of like in it, and then it ends with probably take you several hundred years to get out. And so there's this sort of statement that he's making about just like, this is written in the 90s, and so like, we're questioning like, how much progress have we made, like, as a country, and in our like relationships with race and things like that, and kind of is a poem that really sets the tone of the rest of the book. We can keep just discussing or talking about any of these poems, but that's mostly.
So you gave thank you so much, Justin. You gave a fantastic overview, but what compelled you personally to pursue Baraka as a subject matter? Why does he speak to you as a what are you, like 30 years old?
32.
Yeah, as a 32-year-old, and you're from Tennessee. You grew up here. Yes. And I mean, so do you identify as a white guy? I mean, cisgendered. I mean, you appear to be a cis white guy. Why are you devoting your career to a deceased African American poet? What drew you to this work? I mean, this is a life calling, and I'm sure there are adjacent commitments in your daily life that correspond with your commitment to Baraka. But what about your life story, and what about your life experiences, and what about him as a figure in American history as well as in American poetics draws you to him? Just kind of maybe fess up a little bit about why this is.
Sure. Let's talk about.
Tell us something wild that you discovered, because I know you're learning about him as a kind of as a teacher as well as a poet in your scholarship. So tell me some surprising, wonderful things you've discovered in your journey with him. But tell us a little bit more deeply why you came to this work.
So I think I'll start with just saying like the idea that, and I'm not saying that you were suggesting this, but I think more generally, like the idea that you should only study works that like most closely line up with your identity. Like I think that's not like that's not how I think about. I think like there, literature, like whether it's American literature, world literature, there's a rich tradition that all that you can learn all kinds of things from, not just like folks that look like you or identify with your sexual orientations and have the same sexual orientation or whatever it happens to be. And so I think when I was at Tech, I didn't have much interaction with any literature that fell outside of like the kind of white canon. I think I could count on like 5 fingers like how many people of color I read, and so it was a really big. And I considered myself someone who's pretty well read and had interacted with this, a lot of literature and stuff. But then I got to Memphis, and it's just like, oh, I've not read any of this stuff. And so one of the reasons I'm interested in just the history of, part of my dissertation is about the history of higher education. And so I am interested in like how literature, this is very like maybe esoteric to a lot of y'all, but like the way what is put in our anthologies and whatnot kind of tells us what's important or who is important to read. And I've read a lot of stuff that I never saw in like high school or undergrad. And like, why isn't this included in this work? Because this is good literature. And so I'm very interested in these kind of questions. And I think just the nature of the department at Memphis, like kind of introduced me to a lot of new material and a lot of new ideas that I hadn't interacted with. And part of that is like we have a very strong African-American literature program. And so I took a lot of those classes, and it started with Baraka, and then like I took several other courses, and I kept coming back to Baraka. I didn't like initially think, oh, this is what I want to do my whole dissertation on. But I think reading, actually this course also was the only poetry course I've had in grad school. And I didn't really realize I wanted to do poetry because I was reading novels all the time. But I ended up writing a paper on a Langston Hughes poem, and that kind of started the kernel of my dissertation. And I've actually gone to the Amiri Baraka archive at Columbia University, and I've gotten to, because I've looked at his like teaching records, like his like syllabi and his grades and
so that's
like
in
course materials.
New York City.
Yeah.
So
I went up to Columbia.
You made a pilgrimage to New York City just to look at his old syllabus.
Yeah, I did. And
that's awesome.
I also like the poem, the Langston Hughes poem "Theme for English B," like it talks about this Black student that's going to City College, New York, which is predominantly white college, and basically the poem's about him filling out of place in this school and responding to this writing prompt from a professor, and just sort of like conveying to this instructor like his out of placeness. And one of the things he describes is how his commute from campus as he walks back to the Harlem Y, where he was staying. So I definitely walked the same route. As that's a poem I've written like extensively about, and thinking about Langston Hughes as a teacher of creative writing and how those things interact with the poem, and how is the poem also a commentary on education and higher education in general. And so I think once you've been in school for like, I think I've been in school for 12 years now, but including undergrad and grad school.
Meaning
So,
you've been in school for 24 years, 25 years. Yeah.
So
you just kept going. You didn't, you're in like 40th grade now or something.
oh my gosh, I'm thoroughly institutionalized now. Yeah.
So we're out of time. I want to thank Justin. Please drop some gratitude and any last parting comments in the chat as you leave. If you can drop a comment or a question or something like that in the chat as you go, we'd really appreciate that. Or a shout out to a former tech student. Justin, just in closing, and you can stay on the call just a second as they start to trickle away. But we'll have a little parking lot hallway meeting here as you guys move on to your next class. Class, please come back on Friday for more. The thing that preparing for today and then deciding to invite you at the last minute, and thank you so much for coming, is that I don't think I realized the extent to which by the 70s he was kind of from the academic side and the poetic side and kind of the Black Power Africana side. He's like at a level of like an Al Sharpton or a Jesse Jackson. I mean, he's considered to be the intellectual leader of the Black nation. And this is a time when Black nationalism was very much in the vernacular. So at this time that all these protests are happening, to have more African focused studies in established universities, that Baraka was kind of seen as a leader of an entire Black society. He was kind of an anointed leader of that movement. So kind of almost at the level of like, of Malcolm, of Muhammad Ali, of these kind of cultural leaders, of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I'm trying to just think of like Black cultural leaders. I don't think I quite ascertained how popular he was. And looking through some...
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think, one of the things he does like in like 65 is he gets a government grant to start a school. He starts like a high school. It's called the Black Arts Repertory Theater School. And of course it gets shut down almost immediately because they figure out like that he's teaching these radical politics and stuff. And so it only lasts for like 6 or 8 months, but he is like getting a government grant to do this. But I think he's always thinking about like it from the very beginning about we need to build I know the Black Arts movement felt like one of the failures of the Harlem Renaissance is that it didn't build lasting institutions. And so one of the things the Black Arts movement wanted to do is like actually create new institutions. And maybe the actual legacy of the Black Arts movement are Black studies and minority studies programs in universities as much as anything else, is that